And I would now like to invite to the stage Mr. Erastus Mwencha, who is Deputy Chairman of the African Union Commission.
Thank you very much. Let me start by to thank my predecessor here who has spoken, Vice President Chan, and also recognize Commissioner Pilbags and the distinguished captains of industry and other dignitaries that are in our midst. Vice President has set the scene by giving a very good picture of the complementarity between Africa and Europe when he cited that we share not just a geography, but also a future, our common future, and that it is imperative, being in that boat, that we float together or sink together. I wanted to, first of all, take a very broad look at what brings us together between Europe and Africa, and how those imperatives should continue to inform our discussions, our conversations, but also more on cooperation. It's not that just that Europe and Africa are by accident together, but that proximity has also bonded us in many ways. I'm speaking in English, and I can tell you that the generation, like my children, some of them now are mature people, probably if you ask them, what is your mother's language? I think the first thing they will say is English. Now, isn't that instructive? This union of culture is something that we should now take to other sectors to inform that commonality. And I think sometimes we concentrate so much on what divides us, but not what unites us. And that is the angle I'm going to take in looking at our cooperation. But I will examine it from what I see as trends. And in the process, maybe put some questions to us of how we can, as captains of industry in the private sector, influence the policymakers, but also suggest to you that you also need to take the lead in safeguarding that future, common future. It's good that this topic that we're discussing here says engaging the private sector in a sustainable and inclusive growth. And I think the two words, sustainable and inclusive, are very instructive to us. And I will spend a few minutes on those very words. And for that, I will try to approach it from 5 perspectives. When the Lisbon Treaty was signed in 2008, coming up with the joint Africa-Europe strategy, we agreed on a number of areas that we need to work together. And some of those areas, of course, touch on peace and security, touch on prosperity between us as two continents. But at the center of all this is our people. That whatever we're doing, we should aim at uplifting the quality of lives of the citizens in Europe and the citizens in Africa. But for you in business, I would see this as an opportunity then. That as we improve the quality of life of the citizens of Europe and Africa, here lies the business opportunity. But what are these trends informing us? Maybe before I go into the business world, I should start with the area of peace and security, because for you as a business, perhaps your rate of return, your incentive to invest in a certain area is informed by the environment that obtains in those areas. And this is why, as Africa and Europe, we got together in 2007 to say, let's improve the political peace and security environment so that the business can be able to find an enabling environment to operate in. How is it today? In Africa, I can positively say it's not Africa of 10 years ago. Our leaders are determined to change the paradigm. And today, Africa, in fact, statistics tell us that it's just about 10% of our population that live in what you might call conflict zones. And in those areas, as leaders, we are determined, and we've come up together with instruments at the continental level to make sure that we create that environment for you. And here I must say we are grateful to the European Union for the cooperation that we enjoy in this particular area, without which the support that we have received from Europe, we wouldn't be as made as much progress as we have made today. But while we still have these instances of insecurity, I hope the business community, like I said, we concentrate on what divides us. You don't concentrate on what may have happened yesterday as an incident in Mali or Central Africa and say that is Africa. Africa. Today we are meeting in a very difficult environment because Ukraine crisis is facing us. But Europe cannot be defined by Ukraine. Europe is defined by the strong institutions that are in Europe, and also the foundations of integration and a common focus to move the project ahead, but also to improve the living standards of people in Europe, and not instances that may have happened. But the trends in other areas are worrying. And here, I know you have seen these statistics, and I'm not going to churn them out. Vice President talked of some key 5 areas which I now want to look at. Statistics on how we are performing indicators, particularly in the area of trade, investment, technology flow, positive as they are, the trends don't indicate the potential. And today, the question I want to ask the business community, why are we not exploiting that potential? He's even talked about the rate of return in Africa is the highest. And sure enough, and there's no doubt about it, and I'm sure you as business people know it, that you can't get the rate of return anywhere other than Africa. But the question then is, why are you not investing in Africa? And that's why we're here. Because as leaders meet, they have talked about the area of peace and security. But why are you not coming? Maybe some of it is with our answers. Could be markets which are small, maybe cost of doing business, but the cost of doing business is related to return. The cost of doing business may be high, but the return is high. So why are you not coming in strong numbers? Yes. I think one of the reasons, to me, is, as they say, capital is a coward. And the reason why there is a high rate of return is because some of the cowardice in us as business community means Africa is only attracting a fraction of the investment that is required. And therefore, because of that big need and supply, the laws of economics kick in. Supply creates demand, or a demand creates supply. And because of that, Africa is in need of capital, and it's not flowing in. If you look at the statistics, Europe total capital stock today is just about 250 billion. But if you look at Africa's need, with the GDP now of over 1.5 trillion, if you calculate the GDP of annual capital, Africa needs a lot. That GDP is not going to come from ODA. And access to finance is a challenge. This is where you come in. And so that partnership must come in that area. But what is our commonality also? Look at the area of demographic dividends. Africa is getting younger, Europe is getting older. And as you look down the road, the market in Africa is growing, the market in Europe is declining. Perhaps it might increase in the area of medicine and so forth, but here is an opportunity. If you look down the road to 2050, Africa would be even younger. 1 in every 4 Africans will be a young African in the world. And so for the future, that common future, your market is in Africa. But if you look also at the way costs are moving, I've just come from Abuja, where I was attending a meeting of ministers of finance, and somebody was giving us very interesting statistics. That Africa is now ready, not just the platitudes we have been talking about Africa, that at last 10 years Africa has been growing by 5% and all that. But Africa is now competitive also cost-wise. In fact, if you look at China, in the next 5-10 years, China is supposed to give up about 85 million jobs because they're becoming high cost. Where are these industries going to migrate to? It's Africa. Why can't we see this similar migration from Europe? Why can't we see this similar migration from Europe? Or why can't Europe take advantage of this migration? Because you have the technology. Because if you look at the key areas that we're talking about of our complementarity, yes, Africa has resources. Africa has the market. And that market, Vice President said, now 300 million Africans that are in the middle class. But Africa needs the technology. So here is our complementarity that we should now move to. And globally, as we now see, because the migration of industry is also dictated by not just cost of return, but also inputs. And labor, especially for the labor industries, intensive industries, Africa is the first place of choice. And so I'm here today to tell you that Africa is ready to do business with you. We are improving the security environment, but also the macro environment. And what are the macro environment like? The crisis that was with us in 2007, 2009, that storm bypassed Africa. Why did it bypass Africa? Many might think that it's because Africa is not linked or hooked to the global economy. Africa is. Because if you come to Africa, it's the same banks that are in America, that are in Europe, that are in Africa. But the storm was not as heavy for Africa. Why? Because Africa had gone through structural adjustments in the 90s. And that's why from the year 2000 onwards, growth is steady and macroeconomic stability is there. The growth of 5% is not just the growth rate, but if you look at inflation factors, discipline, particularly in the fiscal and monetary sectors, is highly stable. And as I said, coming from yesterday's meeting of ministers of finance, I was happy to see what they are talking about. They are now saying, look at your levels of debt so that Africa can continue to sustain stable macroeconomic stability. Now, coming to the areas of trade, there are some concerns from Africa. And these we want to bring to you, to the business community. One of our concerns is that we have been traditional partners for years. You even gave us access for many years, duty-free, quota-free, without reciprocity. We squandered that opportunity. In fact, only 1 or 2 countries in Africa took advantage of that opportunity. The rest of us, that window passed by. Of course, now the WTO discipline has kicked in, and because of that, we are saying, in this new dispensation, we must have a new display of trade. But as we try to design this architecture of trade, let us do it in such a way that we are not putting any one of us in a handicapped position. I always use example that trade, the WTO should use golf rules. Under golf rules, I can play Tiger Woods because all he has to do is to tell me that as we start kicking up the ball, I have already scored 5 points. And he has to fight to score to catch up with me. Why can't we develop this kind of trade discipline? Because at the moment, we worried that if the architecture of global trade is again for us to play a chess game, that could again put Africa in a situation that we've been in, where we had market access, but we never exploited it. What did Africa do? The reason Africa didn't do it, and now I'm coming to inclusive and sustainable, is because Africa had no supply capacity. The growth rate that Africa has been enjoying in the last 10 years is not sustainable because the base is too narrow. It is a base that is based at best on commodity with very little value addition. Vice President talked about industrialization as being key. So to talk about sustainability, Africa must talk about industrialization. And here is another complementarity that you talked about. There's a market in Africa, but Africa has the raw materials, but Africa doesn't have capital, doesn't have know-how. And so what we need is, in addition to technology, is skills. In Africa, we have recognized this. And one of the things we are now saying, education, access to education, universal, we're working on that. Many countries will be able to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. Some will miss it. But that's not the issue now. The next issue is to impart knowledge, to go to what he was talking about, space science, to be in the frontier of also research and development, but to create entrepreneurs. And in Africa, to start with, we are saying, let's start with higher education. And we are starting to look at setting up world-class universities that can partner with universities so that we don't have to be sending students from Africa just to come to Europe. If we can create capacity so that more can learn, it's cost-effective. This is an area of huge scope for cooperation between Europe and Africa. And the private sector can play a role too, to support the private institutions, but also the universities that are coming up. Now, one challenge that I want to bring out, and this is something that we have noticed, especially in the last few years, where the private sector has also played a role, is the private sector also to join in the trade arena and create non-tariff barriers so that you can protect your market. And one sector that is mostly affected is agriculture. Because here again we can talk about comparative advantage. Africa has comparative advantage in this sector. Africa has competitive advantage. But what we are asking here is that if we remove the non-tariff barriers, then Africa will be able to be a basket, not just for Africa, but also feed the world. My colleague, Commissioner for Agriculture, is here, and I'm sure she will be talking about that later on. So what I want to look at now is our common future, which is inclusive, means if Africa is prosperous, Europe would be prosperous. If Africa is poor, we export to each other challenges. Because even in instances of peace and security are by and large informed by, among other things, whether it's governance, but also poverty. And so we need to look at those young people, give them skills, give them jobs. And Europe will not have to be worrying that there are some irregular immigrants that are trying to reach Europe. Because all they are trying to is look for employment opportunities or livelihood. So our commonalities tie together that let's have inclusive growth, that prosperous Europe and a prosperous Africa is good for us. And that is what ties us together. With that 1 billion plus population in Africa and Europe, 400 million now and plus, we are tied together. And of course we may have differences. Of course there should be differences. Not necessarily that you work for differences. But the question is, how do we solve them? That's why our leaders meet here. That's why as business people you meet here. So that once we can talk about this, to create a congenial environment for you to make money, for the prosperity of people, because when you make money, you create jobs, you create employment, you create prosperity, and our 2 continents will be peaceful. I have not talked about all these other issues, like ICT, infrastructure, because I know you know all that. But I have dwelt on the political aspect, that we need to inform our leaders that our future is tied together in business, in peace and security, and we have to work for it to make it a better future for Europe and Africa. Thank you so much.